Scientists believe the universe began at the Big Bang some 13.8 billion years ago. What if the universe actually began 5 minutes ago? If the universe began uncaused, then every possible universe can begin to exist uncaused.
And interested to hear, are you kind of on David's philosophical train to this point, or are you want to raise some red flags?
I already want to get off the train.
All right.
Causes constrain their effects. However, the implicit claim is that if there was no cause, then nothing would constrain what happens. And that I don't think is true.
There's so much evidence that makes it seem like the natural world, the Earth, is billions of years old. All we have to do is, cut open a tree. What if the tree just popped into existence 5 minutes ago with those rings already in it?
If you believe in a singular Big Bang model, you can't extend space-time beyond that singularity. What you could have is a different model that wasn't singular, in which the curvature never became infinite.
What we can observe is limited by the speed of light. The sun is about 8 light minutes away from us. We're not actually looking at what the sun looks like right now. We're looking at what the sun looked like 8 minutes ago. For us to get the impression that the universe is much older than it actually is, all that would need to happen if the universe is only 5 minutes old is for all the particles within our 5-minute light cone to be configured correctly to give us the appearance of age.
If we deny something called the past hypothesis, then we end up being skeptics about all kinds of things that we shouldn't be skeptical about. The laws of physics are time symmetric. So the only way that you can say that you're able to gather data and accurately make assessments of the universe is if you put this low entropy boundary condition in one direction of time. Without that, you can't reach this conclusion.
Welcome to this episode of Premiere Unbelievable. I'm your host, Vince Vitale, and today is an especially exciting episode because we're going to have the chance to engage with some new ideas and new arguments about the existence of God. So new, actually, that they have not yet been published. Here with us for the discussion today are two excellent thinkers, David Liu and Daniel Linford. David is pursuing both an MD to become a medical doctor and also a PhD at Stanford University. And our discussion today will be based on his forthcoming paper, The Universe Didn't Begin Uncaused, which will soon be published in the top-tier philosophy of religion journal, Faith and Philosophy. In that paper, David argues that if God does not exist, we might actually have reason to believe that the universe is only 5 minutes old. More on that idea soon. David is joined today by Dan Linford, an instructor in philosophy and religious studies at Old Dominion University, co-author of Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. Great title. And also co-host of the Sci-Fi, that's PHI, podcast. So be sure to check that out. David actually references Dan and his research in his new article. So this is a great pairing for the show today. A very warm and grateful welcome to you both. And as we get started, I always like hearing something about people's stories, because it turns out that not everyone spends their time thinking about the causes of the universe and taking seriously hypotheses such as it only being 5 minutes old. But you two do. And I'm interested to know how that started for each of you and just what motivates you in your pursuit of the deep questions of life. Dan, maybe I'll start with you. Welcome to the show. Were you always interested in these types of questions?
Yeah, I think so. I think for as long as I can remember, I was interested in deep questions and in the sciences. My undergraduate degree was in physics, but then after spending a short time in a physics PhD program, I realized that I really wanted to pursue was philosophy, and so I switched to a philosophy department and eventually got my PhD from Purdue University, where I worked with Paul Draper.
Excellent. And how about you, David? I know you've been a long-time listener to the show. Were these sorts of questions always important to you?
Yeah, thank you, Vince, for that amazing introduction. Yeah, I grew up in a Christian family. I went to church every Sunday. And when I started in college, I really started questioning, why do I believe what I believe? Am I Christian just because my parents are Christian? And for a long time, I was agnostic. I really didn't know what I believed. All I knew was that the two most important questions that I could possibly answer in this life are, does God exist? And if God does exist, what is his purpose for my life? My dad got wind that I was having doubts in my faith. So he went to the local Christian bookstore and bought 2 popular level Christian apologetics books for me. And when I read them, I was blown away because it was for probably the first time in my life that I read someone that was trying to make an intellectual case for God's existence. And, over time, I kind of outgrew those popular level books and decided to do a master's in philosophy to really dig deep at these questions at a very high academic level. And this paper was part of a result of that work. One of the most classic arguments for the existence of God is the Kalām cosmological argument. And basically, my work is trying to provide reasons for believing one of its premises, namely that if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. So yeah, excited to delve into that more.
Okay, great, guys. Well, thank you for being here. And yeah, why don't we start to open up some of your arguments, David, and then we'll give Dan a chance to respond to them as well. As I was reading through your paper, I was remembering that personally, when I was trying to figure out whether God exists, one of the challenges for me was actually the idea of an invisible, all-powerful God just creating the universe out of nothing. And I thought that just seemed sort of too fantastical to believe, and that surely there must be more sober, sensible, reasonable scientific explanations of the universe that would be kind of easier to accept. One of the things I took from your article, David, is this suggestion that if we don't believe in God, you might actually wind up having to believe something as extraordinary as the idea of a God creating the universe. Namely, you might wind up having to believe that the universe is less than 5 minutes old. Now, that's going to take some unpacking because obviously there are lots of people who don't believe in God and also don't believe that the universe is 5 minutes old. They believe it's billions of years old. So, David, here's an opportunity for you to start to give us a sketch of how your argument works.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vince. So basically, my paper is trying to argue that, as you said, if the universe has a beginning, or if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause for its existence. And the last part of my paper, I try to argue that the best explanation for the cause of the universe is an all-loving, all-powerful God. So how do I get there? So I can divide my argument up to a few parts. The first part, which I'll focus on, is the claim that if the universe began to exist uncaused, then it is overwhelmingly likely that the universe began less than 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. Now, I know to listeners that may sound absolutely absurd. Like, David, what do you mean the universe began 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age, right? Like, I am personally 26 years old. I look like I'm 26 years old, right? So how could the universe be only 5 minutes old? I have memories of events from, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, right? So if I have memory of those events, then how could the universe be so young? Similarly, if we go into the natural world, there's so much evidence that makes it seem like the natural world, the Earth, is like, universe is billions of years old, right? Like all we have to do is, cut open a tree, count the number of rings a tree has, where each ring represents 1 year the tree has been alive, and we'll seemingly have like this amazing scientific evidence that the universe is much older, right? So one thought I want to put in the listeners' minds is this: what if scientists believe the universe began at the Big Bang some 13.8 billion years ago? What if the first instance the universe actually began was 5 minutes ago? And it just so happens that when the universe began 5 minutes ago, all of the particles in the universe were arranged in the way they would have to be arranged if to make it seem like the universe began at the Big Bang. So if 5 minutes ago, all the particles arranged such that I would exist, my body would exist, such that all of the neurons in my brain would be configured in the way they would need to be configured to give me memories of the past, then I may seem like I'm 26 years old. I may have memories of a 26-year-old, but really, as long as those atoms are configured in the right way, it would just seem that way, even though it's not the case. Similarly, what if the tree just popped into existence 5 minutes ago with those rings already in it, so that when we chop it open, it may seem like the tree is much older than it actually is? So this is a question I want to ask. What if the first instance of the universe was actually what it was 5 minutes ago, and just all the atoms were configured correctly to make it appear as if it was much older? So how do I actually justify this? So the first part of our argument is this: if the universe began uncaused, then every possible universe can begin to exist uncaused. So how do I rationalize this? So let's first talk about what a cause does. Causes, not only do they bring about their effect, they also constrain the properties of their effect. So for example, the wall behind me is white. Why is it white? Because some painter or construction worker painted it white, right? There was a painter who was a cause who constrained the color of the wall to white. But imagine if the wall behind me just popped into existence uncaused. No construction worker, no painter, just popped into existence. Then there would have been nothing to constrain the color of the wall to white. The wall could have been black, it could have been neon pink, it could have been polka dotted. The wall could have been any color or combination of color if it began uncaused. Similarly, I would say the same is with the universe. If the universe began uncaused, then there would be nothing to constrain the initial state of the universe to be the Big Bang state. There'd be nothing to actually make it the case that it's the Big Bang state, rather than maybe the state that the universe was in a billion years ago, or a million years ago, or even the state of the universe like 5 minutes ago, right? There'll be nothing to make it the case to constrain the universe so that its first instant of time is what it was at Big Bang than what it was, maybe 5 minutes ago. I would similarly add, right, for one universe to be more likely to begin to exist uncaused than another, there must be some underlying predisposition or bias that makes it the case that one universe is more likely to begin uncaused than another. But if the universe began uncaused, what we're saying is that the universe began by nothing and from nothing. And nothing, by definition, has no predisposition, has no bias. So if the universe began uncaused, then every possible universe could have begun uncaused. And it's equally likely that any possible universe begins uncaused. So that's the first part of my argument. I'd be really interested to hear, Dan's response.
Yeah, that's great. I know there's more that you'll want to share in your argument, but Dan, interested to hear, are you kind of on David's philosophical train to this point, or are you want to raise some red flags at this point?
I already want to get off the train. So, so one of the things to notice is that, so part of what David said was that causes constrain their effects. That's certainly true. I want to grant that. However, the implicit claim is that if there was no cause, then nothing would constrain what happens. And that I don't think is true. So, for example, when we talk about the color of the wall, it can't be that the wall is any combination of colors. So, for example, it can't be that the wall is orange all over and purple all over. That's what philosophers call metaphysically impossible. So what's metaphysically possible, what's metaphysically impossible is going to constrain things, even if causes don't. So it's not that, so if things can begin without causes, if that's true, if the causal principle is false, it's not going to be true that just anything can happen. There are things that still couldn't happen. In the case of the universe beginning to exist, there's a bunch of things that I really like about David's article. He provides an original argument for the causal principle. He nicely summarizes a bunch of the relevant philosophy of religion literature. He includes a nice summary of the data that helps us to determine the universe's age. But one sort of gripe that I have with David's article is that he doesn't interact very much with the relevant philosophy of physics literature. So there's an old debate in philosophy of physics about whether or not the universe is what's called maximally extended. So a space-time is maximally extended if it's, in some sense, as large as it could possibly be. So if you ask, well, could the universe be 5 minutes old? Well, if the universe is as large as it could possibly be, it could be larger than 5 minutes old. So if it's maximally extended, if it has to be maximally extended, then it's going to extend past 5 minutes ago. Now, one thing about classical Big Bang theory is that it turns out that there are some space-time models that have this feature that even though they're as large as they can possibly be, they have a kind of boundary in the past direction that you might think of as a beginning. So when people say that there are models of the Big Bang in which there's a beginning, well, that's not true for all models of the Big Bang, but at least for some of them, there's a beginning. In those ones which there is a beginning, the space-time can be maximally extended, but it can't be anything. But if space-time needs to be maximally extended as a matter of metaphysical necessity, then it couldn't be only 5 minutes old. So one thing that I would really have liked to have seen a discussion of is this literature on whether space-time needs to be maximally extended. Right? That's what David needs to deny. David needs to say that, well, had it not been for the causal principle, then space-time wouldn't be maximally extended. But I don't know why we should accept that.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So I think there's two main points. The first point is even without cause, it seems like there are some ways or some explanations that could still constrain what the first state of the universe looked like. So the example you gave is like even with the wall, right? It couldn't be red over and white over at the same time. Another example is like imagine the universe with a finite amount of particles. It couldn't be the case that the universe has both simultaneously an even number of particles and an odd number of particles. That universe state just couldn't exist, right? Couldn't begin to exist because it couldn't exist. And in my paper, I run through a lot of the potential quote unquote non-causal explanations. And I think for that point, I would raise just like, okay, that's fair. Maybe there are things that just can't exist at all. And maybe that is like a logical or physical constraint of like universe states that can't exist at all can't also begin to exist. But I would argue that any universe state that could possibly exist can also possibly begin to exist if the universe can begin uncaused. So if we limit our universes to only universes that could possibly exist, given the laws of logic, the laws of physics, then we could talk only about that realm of universe states and see where we can get there. As to your second point about interacting more with the physics literature, yeah, I actually haven't heard about that idea before, and that's something I definitely have to look into. One of the reasons I was really looking forward to this dialogue, Dan, is because you're much more well read on this physics literature than I am. So I always think like, oh, maybe there's something I haven't thought of yet that I need to interact with. So that's definitely something I need to think about more. So thank you.
Yeah. So the question here is something like this. So, there are what you call omphalos universes. These are universes that have the appearance of being old, but are in fact not old. In the philosophy of physics literature, they're what are called truncated spacetimes. So if space-time doesn't need to be maximally extended, if it doesn't need to be as large as it could possibly be, then it's what's called truncated, right? So for instance, you could have a boundary 5 minutes into the past, where we think of that boundary as the beginning. Now the objection here was that if any subsequent state could exist, that subsequent state could be the beginning. But again, someone who thinks that space-time as a matter of metaphysical necessity needs to be maximally extended is not going to accept it, right? They're going to think that as a matter of natural law, there's no way that the universe could be in which it's presently only 5 minutes old. Right? So if this thesis about space-time being maximally extended, but it must being maximally extended is true, then omphalos universes are just not physically possible.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I guess two things I would say response. The first one is I think with any philosophical argument, there's always unfortunately not even mine. There's always going to be problems, right? Every philosophical argument will have ways to get around it. And if it means adopting this view that space-time must be maximally extended, if someone needs to adopt that view in order to get past at least this segment of argument, I can totally grant that. There's no and maybe it's something I need to think about more. It sounds like, at least from what I'm hearing, Dan, it seems like a more speculative idea that's not necessarily widely accepted in the physics community.
No, actually, it is widely accepted. Okay. In fact, so what's not widely accepted is the position that it's not true. So there's a few people like G.B. Manshak who have brought the thesis into question, but most physicists, in fact, and most philosophers of physics accept the thesis that space-time is maximally extended. Sort of the standard line goes back to John Earman, who considers the possibility that it's not true that space-time is maximally extended, and then says, look, if there's going to be some place where space-time has an arbitrary boundary, what could possibly explain the fact that it has that arbitrary boundary? And if it looks like there's not going to be a sufficient explanation for that boundary, then what we should think instead is that space-time is maximally extended.
Let me ask you, Dan. So on my view, on this view that, it's given that the universe has a beginning, right? When you say space-time is maximally extended, there would still be like an arbitrary point in which it did begin to exist, right? It's not like it extends past the Big Bang and eternally into the past, right? So
it wouldn't have to be past eternal, but okay. the point of the Big Bang wouldn't be arbitrary either. So the reason why so in classical models of the Big Bang, right? So if people don't know the bit of physics that tells us about the Big Bang, at least has traditionally done so, is a theory called general relativity. And in general relativity, you can solve the equations of general relativity called the Einstein field equations. You can solve them for possible space-time models. And if you do that um, for a for the for some Big Bang scenarios, then what you find is that there's a place beyond which you cannot, as a matter of physical law, extend space-time. And why? Because in that domain, the curvature of space-time becomes arbitrarily large. It becomes infinite, effectively. And because it becomes infinite, because it becomes arbitrarily large, there's no way to keep for space-time to continue on further into the past beyond that. So if space-time is maximally extended, then the only possible way to have a beginning is with something like a Big Bang singularity. Otherwise, there just are no beginnings.
I see. Yeah. So maybe one way to maybe view this is I feel like there may be even a more general principle at play here where like if possibly something could be caused, then it does have a cause, at least in the space-time manifold, right? So because any state prior to the Big Bang could possibly have a cause for it, therefore we have to track it all the way to Big Bang. But because the Big Bang could have a cause for it, because our theories general relativity break down or whatever, then we can't have a cause before that. Is that accurate way of describing?
So you could put it that way if you want. It's one argument for system being maximally extended. You could think that each moment, as it were, is caused by a previous one. Well, that's not the way that I would put it, but someone who had a view that each moment of time causes a subsequent moment, and that each moment needs to have a cause, needs to be caused by a prior moment in order to exist. That would give you, at least in terms of a Big Bang model, that would give you maximally extended space-time. Now, one reason I wouldn't put it that way is that I don't think that we have good reason to think that any time that a physical thing begins to exist, that it has a cause. And so that people don't misunderstand me, I don't mean that there's just things popping into existence at random. I mean that there are things that come into existence for the sake of a sufficient cause that may be determined to exist, but what is determining them to exist is something other than a cause. So you might think, for instance, if there are such things as moments, if we imagine space-time chopped up into moments, then you might have a view according to which, as a matter of natural law, each moment necessitates all the prior moments and all the future ones. If you had a model like that, and you made some further assumptions, some further mathematical assumptions, for people who are interested, you have to assume that space-time was what's called globally hyperbolic. But if you made some further assumptions, then that would also give you a maximally extended space-time. And it would tell you that because that each moment necessitates both forward and backwards through time, each one of those moments gives you the full manifold. Each moment necessitates the full thing.
I see. So maybe I could potentially frame it like this, and I'm curious to hear your response. So, like, the purpose of my argument is to show that it's overwhelmingly likely the case that the universe began less than 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. So, not the Big Bang, less than 5 minutes ago. And you're arguing, well, Maxwell's equations may say that the entire space-time manifold all the way back to the Big Bang is necessary. So it's not like you can just have a beginning at 5-minute mark. It had to have begun at the Big Bang, or else it wouldn't. So I guess the thing I would say to that is that two things I would say is this. The purpose of my argument is to show that the universe began less than 5 minutes ago. So I'm not saying you're doing this, but I would be wary of anyone who says, well, it had to have begun at the Big Bang because it had to have, right? My question is, what reasons do you have? We can't just presuppose that, right?
So
I'm not saying you are. So you give these reasons why. And I guess my argument is if there's this general principle that, every moment needs an explanation, maybe not a cause. I think you run into, problems with, argument for contingency, principle of sufficient reason. Like, why, if the Big Bang could have an explanation, people would argue like there is something prior to that that would explain it, right?
Well, so in fact, I don't think that the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe, right? You asked previously, like whether or not the principle that space-time must be maximally extended would entail that that space-time is infinitely, or sorry, the universe is infinitely old or something like that. It doesn't have that entailment. There are maximally extended space-times in which there's a boundary at the Big Bang that the laws are not going to allow you to have something prior to. However, there are also solutions to Einstein's field equations. There are other space-time models we can write down in which there is no such boundary at the Big Bang. And in fact, I mean, on my own view, I don't think it's a settled question yet as to whether or not the universe began at the Big Bang. We can write down models either way. They're going to be distinct models, right? They're distinct solutions to the Einstein field equations. But I don't see a good reason to think that the universe must either have a beginning or must either not have a beginning.
Let me jump in there, Dan, at that point, and we'll continue the conversation, but we just need to take a quick break here. We'll be back very soon. I'm Vince Vitale, and you're listening to Unbelievable with my guests, Dan Linford and David Liu. We always love to hear your feedback. Head over to premierunbelievable.com where you can ask your question or follow, like, and subscribe to our social media channels. I'm also excited to tell you about a well-loved podcast of Premier Unbelievable that is launching a new season. Take a look, and we will see you back here in just a moment.
Christianity appeals to history, and to history it must go. In other words, it really matters that this stuff did happen. There's a very interesting passage in Acts chapter 23 when St. Paul says this is all about resurrection, knowing perfectly well that that puts the cat among the pigeons. We know of roughly a dozen Jewish messianic or revolutionary or prophetic movements in the 100 years or two either side of the time of Jesus. Once we think about how resurrection language actually worked in the first century, then I think we have to say that the most likely explanation, historically speaking, is that Jesus really was bodily raised from the dead, leaving the empty tomb behind him.
The Ask NT Wright Anything podcast.
Welcome back to Premier Unbelievable, where, if you can believe it, we are discussing whether the universe is only 5 minutes old. Great news for those of us who are starting to age. We may actually be a lot younger than we think. David Liu has argued in a forthcoming paper in the top-tier journal Faith and Philosophy that only God gives us good reason to think the universe is more than 5 minutes old. Dan Linford, instructor in philosophy and religious studies at Old Dominion University, has been raising some concerns about this novel argument. So just to get our listeners back our heads around where we've gotten to this point, David, you've been arguing along the lines that if God doesn't exist and therefore didn't create the universe, then the most likely alternative could have been that the universe began uncaused. And if that were the case, then there might be many more possibilities of how it could have began with the appearance of age than the one possibility of it actually being the age that it seems, stretching back to the Big Bang. So that's kind of a very rough sketch of kind of where we've gotten to in the argument, and Dan has raised some concerns about that. But now, if I understand correctly, you think you have a further argument, not just that the universe is likely younger than it appears to be, but actually that it's less than 5 minutes old. So I'm interested to hear, and then we can continue the discussion, but interested to hear, how do you get from there are all these possibilities of when it could have began to it's actually likely to be less than 5 minutes old?
Yeah, thank you so much, Vince. And I wanted to respond to Dan's last point because I think, this point is so important and address it before I get on to the second part of my argument. So the reason I asked Dan, like, what motivations is there in these models to stop at the Big Bang or to continue past the Big Bang? And it seems like what Dan says is that, well, we could model a maximally extended universe that stops at the Big Bang, or it can even go past the Big Bang, right? So what I would say is, it doesn't seem like in these models, there is like an absolute point in which we have to stop. the physics by itself doesn't seem to suggest this is exactly where you have to stop. And you can't go any farther. That's why I asked, is there like a causal explanation or some form of explanation, physical explanation for why we stop here and not somewhere else? If that's the case, I can fully accept the idea that we can model the universe as if it was maximally extended and, assume that the maximum extension stops at the Big Bang, or even something prior to the Big Bang. But because as a model, it doesn't actually, and if there's nothing to tell us where to stop, where the initial state actually is, then what that means is the initial state could have been the state 5 minutes ago. It could have been the state 6 minutes ago.
So that's not right. Suppose it was 5 minutes ago and the spacetime is maximally extended, that would mean that the spacetime curvature in our neck of the woods and where we live in the universe, that the spacetime curvature here is really extraordinary. It would mean that we would look around and, you'd be like instantly vaporized. But supposedly you could look around, you'd see yourself surrounded by this hot, dense state. People talk about the Big Bang singularity, for example. The singularity is a point where the spacetime curvature becomes infinite. And any model that includes a spacetime singularity, what's really called a curvature singularity, spacetime comes to an end at the singularity. By the way, it's the same thing. The same thing is true for a classical model of, say, a black hole, where if you, in a classical model of a black hole, time comes to an end at the center of the black hole, the singularity at the center. So if you believe in a singular Big Bang model, if you think that's what the universe is really like, then you can't extend spacetime beyond that singularity. What you could have is a different model that wasn't singular, in which the curvature never became infinite, in which it never had this like super hot dense state that we associate with very early times in the universe. You could have that, right? People talk about like bouncing models where instead of going through a Big Bang singularity, you have one universe that bounces into another, for example. But so long as you're actually talking about a singular Big Bang model, you cannot extend the space-time manifold past the singularity. In fact, that's part of the definition of a curvature singularity.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Dan. So it sounds like what's the case is we can either have a singularity theorem or a non-singularity theorem. In the case of singularity theorem, it could still be the case that we popped into existence a few moments ago, but we would be entirely vaporized, right? And we wouldn't be living for long. And I'm happy to grant that. Like, if anything, I could repurpose my argument in that case to say, if the universe began cause, then our universe would have still begun moments ago, but we would all have, been evaporated and disintegrated in a few seconds. And a non-singular theorem, though, maybe my argument does go through. So maybe I can talk about that portion, and we can discuss that further. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So how do I get to the point from if the universe began cause, then it is overwhelmingly likely the case that the universe began less than 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. So, as I said before, if the universe began cause, it seems like every possible universe could begin uncaused, and it's equally probable that any possible universe begins a cause. So, I first want to give an analogy to the listeners to really drive home this point. It's a very famous analogy that involves a monkey and a typewriter. So imagine you're in a room where there's a monkey typing on a typewriter, and the monkey is allowed to type randomly on the typewriter for 100 pages. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, Shakespeare's Hamlet fits perfectly within these 100 pages, right? And there's a second condition. After the monkey is done typing 100 pages, if the monkey types less than 1 page of Hamlet perfectly, then the room explodes and you die. If the monkey types 1 or more pages of Hamlet perfectly, then you survive and the bomb doesn't explode. So you wait nervously as the monkey's typing, and after it types the 100 pages, miraculously, you don't explode and you survive. Now, let's say without looking at the document, I just ask you, which one is more likely to have occurred? The monkey typed 1 to 5 pages of Hamlet perfectly, or the monkey typed 5 to 100 pages of Hamlet perfectly. Obviously, it seems like 1 to 5 pages, right? Because the more letters the monkey had to have typed correctly, the less likely it is the case the monkey would have typed those letters in that correct order, right? So I would say the same is with our universe. So when we're talking about a universe that gives us the appearance of age, what we can observe is limited by the speed of light. We can only visually observe something if there has been enough time for an object in the universe, to have emitted light, and for that light to have traveled to us so that we can observe it, right? Let's talk about the sun. The sun is about 8 light minutes away from us. What that means is when we're looking at a sun, we're not actually looking at what the sun looks like right now. We're looking at what the sun looked like 8 minutes ago. And if the sun somehow just popped out of existence in this instance, we wouldn't actually notice it had disappeared for another 8 minutes, right? So physicists have described what's called our past light cone. You can imagine the past light cone as a sphere, very simply, as a sphere that surrounds the Earth, where any particle within the sphere has had enough time for light to travel and reach us so that we can observe it. And any particle outside the sphere hasn't had enough time. And as the universe gets older and older, assuming there's not some kind of black hole or something else, as the universe gets older and older, the size of the sphere increases in size. So if if our Earth is 5 minutes old, then roughly the radius of the sphere would be 5 light minutes. Of our light cone would be 5 light minutes. Whereas if the universe is 10 minutes old, the radius of our light cone would be 10 light minutes, right? So the question then becomes, which one is more likely to have occurred? For us to get the impression that the universe is much older than it actually is, all that would need to happen if the universe is only 5 minutes old is for all the particles within our 5-minute light cone to be configured correctly to give us the appearance of age. However, if the universe is 10 minutes old, every particle within the 10-minute light cone, which would include the sun, will have to be configured correctly to give us the appearance of age, right? So as the universe gets older and older, more particles and more particles need to be configured correctly to give us the appearance of age. So similar to the monkey typewriter example, given that the more pages the monkey has to type correctly, the less likely it is to occur. I would also argue the more particles that need to be configured correctly in our light cone, the less and less likely it is to occur. So when I do the math, some just back of the napkin calculations, you can show that the chances that the universe began to exist with a 5-minute light cone of perfectly configured particles is 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 59 times more likely than if the universe began with a perfectly configured 10-minute light cone. In the end, if we have the stipulation that we should only look at universe states that could give rise to what we currently observe, then it becomes overwhelmingly likely that if the universe began to exist uncaused, then we live in a universe that began less than 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age.
Let me see if I can understand your view. So on your view, you would say that the universe began in the Big Bang, right?
Yeah, I don't think I for the purpose of this discussion, I could say that I'm not committed to that view. And if you point out some problem with it, maybe, yeah. But yeah.
No,
so,
I
yeah.
mean, do you think that the universe began?
Yes, given this argument, we presume that the universe had a beginning. Yeah,
okay.
It doesn't say it had to be at the Big Bang. It could have been, some other point.
The only models that we have of the universe having a beginning are singular models, right? So there's a choice point here. You can either say that we live in a non-singular space-time, in which case, if you concede that space-time must be maximally extended, then the universe is infinitely old. Or you say that we live in a singular space-time where there's a Big Bang singularity where space-time terminates at the third option, of course, is to deny the thesis that space-time is maximally extended. So those are the choices on the table. If you want to say that we do know that the universe began in, say, the Big Bang, then, and you want to concede the thesis that space-time is maximally extended to me, then you're going to have to, you're not going to be able to say that, you're not going to be able to truncate space-time in the way that you want for an omphalos universe, right? So
yeah. Yeah, so I guess, yeah. So, I could, yeah, like someone could commit to the fact that space-time isn't maximally extended. I still don't understand the point in which so just because we can model the universe being maximally extended, past the Big Bang. So can you explain again, what reasons do we have to do that rather than assuming like the first state was like 5 minutes ago in like a non-singular.
So
because we need a reason to justify why we can continue doing that.
Are you asking David whether there's a distinction here between the physical possibility and the metaphysical possibility?
Right. Yeah, exactly. There's a physical possibility. There's a way we can model the universe, and there's a physical possibility, but there's a metaphysical possibility of like, it doesn't seem like that needs to be the case. So just because the physics can model it as being the case doesn't mean it has to have been the case in the metaphysical.
So that's right.
Yeah.
But I can think of 5 different reasons as to why we might think that it's true that as a matter of metaphysical necessity, space-time must be maximally extended. So first of all, there's an epistemic argument, which is very similar to the argument that you've given, that if space-time doesn't have to be maximally extended, then for all we know, it began last Tuesday. That's very similar to the argument that you're giving. But that argument could itself be retooled to support a thesis according to which, as a matter of metaphysical necessity, space-time must be maximally extended. A second argument is that this is a point that I really wanted to get to as well. But your project assumes that we can cut space-time up into these universe-wide moments, and that's just not going to be true for relativistic spacetimes in general. It's not going to be true that you can have those, but what is going to be true is that you could have this maximal extension thesis, regardless of whether or not you can chop space-time into moments. I mean, whether space-time can be cleanly chopped into moments, as you're suggesting, depends upon what the matter-energy distribution in space-time actually is. It's a contingent feature of the universe that, for all we know, the universe does not, in fact, have. But yet, the thesis that I'm proposing would then apply to a far broader class of spacetimes. But if we suppose that space-time can be chopped up into those moments, then we have a further set of reasons as to why someone might think that space-time has to be maximally extended. So if we have a view of laws, like either Tim Maudlin has, or that someone like Ellis has, that is, if we're scientific essentialists, then given a formulation of general relativity, it's called the Hamiltonian formulation of general relativity. That's going to be the formulation that allows you to make your argument. Given that that formulation of general relativity, each moment, each one of what are called space-like surfaces or Cauchy surfaces in the universe's development are going to necessitate all of the others, both backwards and forwards through time. Here's a fourth reason. That it would explain why, given that the universe has lasted for some time, it would explain why the universe continues to last into the future. If space-time could be arbitrarily truncated at any place, then even though it's been around for some time, it could just come to an end tomorrow for no reason at all. But yet, if we endorse the thesis that as a matter of metaphysical necessity, space-time is maximally extended, the universe cannot come to an end just arbitrarily tomorrow. Here's a fifth reason. You want to have a measure over possible states that the universe can have. Those states are what you've been calling moments. You want to have a probability distribution, an associated probability with each one of those that's what you do in your article. But the more standard move that people make in the philosophy of physics literature and in the physics literature is not to associate a measure of probability distribution with those individual states, those individual moments, but rather to an entire trajectory through phase space. Now, if space-time is maximally extended, then the only trajectories through phase space that are going to be the ones that or the ones over which there's some probability at all, are going to be ones that did not have a beginning 5 minutes into the past. Right? So we get to rule out Omphalos universes for those 5 distinct reasons, and those 5 distinct reasons, I think, solve the problems that you bring up better than the metaphysical proposal that you've made.
Yeah, sorry. So there's a lot of reasons. So I probably have to, if you want, you may have to repeat some of them. Um, I think there is still a difference between positing something that's physically possible to the point that it must be metaphysically necessary. And I think one of the reasons you gave was like, well, if it's metaphysically necessary, then we could also predict that the future isn't just going to end at some point in the past. But there are still plenty of other reasons we could give for why the future doesn't end the past. That doesn't have to deal with the fact that space time is metaphysically.
I'm not saying this hypothesis is something we know to be true. I'm saying the hypothesis that as a matter of metaphysical necessity, space-time is maximally extended, is a hypothesis on the table, and it resolves this issue. It addresses this issue just like your hypothesis does. Do I know that's true? No, but as long as it's on the table and it's one that addresses this issue, and I think addresses it better than your hypothesis does, then we have reason not to accept your hypothesis.
And then, Dan, I'm interested to know, so if that were false, if it were the case that space-time could be truncated and the universe could have began kind of at any slice with the appearance of age, contrary to your view, if that were true, would you think that David's argument would be plausible for someone who held those assumptions about how the universe could have began, contrary to your assumptions? I'm interested, in whether somebody who does believe that it's metaphysically possible that the universe could have come to exist 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age, just as as it seems to be to us, for somebody who did hold that assumption, would the argument then work?
So there's a further issue here that I think is in David's argument. And that's how he sets up the probabilities that he wants to talk about. So the part of what David wants to do is he wants to say that there are these moments or instants of time, right? And a moment is supposed to be something that goes across the entire universe. So for instance, you might have intuitively thought that there is such a thing as what's going on the planet Jupiter right now. Right? A moment is something that there's now all over the entire universe. But in fact, what relativity tells us is that there is in general no such thing as moments. Now, what you can do is that there are some relativistic spacetimes that have these things that people want to call moments. So in many models of the Big Bang, there's a way of slicing up spacetime so that on each one of the slices, the distribution of matter and energy is uniform. And people want to say that way of slicing of spacetime, slices of spacetime into what they want to call moments. But whether or not you can do that kind of slicing is going to depend upon what the distribution of matter and energy is in spacetime. But that fact that slicing is going to depend upon the distribution of matter and energy, whether or not that slicing is even possible is going to depend upon that distribution, then tells us that if you have a variable that ranges over that slicing, that variable is probably not going to be a natural variable in the theory. And what part of what David wants to do in order to write down the probabilities he wants to write down is to make use of a technical principle called it's a principle from Robin Collins called the restricted principle of indifference. We don't necessarily have to get into what that principle is, but part of what that principle is going to require is that we find a natural variable inside of our scientific theory, and without having that variable, we're not going to be able to do the probability calculations that David wants to do. Now, I have an alternative way of talking about these sorts of things that I think makes sense if we don't make the kinds of assumptions that David wants to make. As I was saying, the way that people usually do this is that they define a probability distribution over the possible trajectories that a physical system can take. Right, so physicists define this abstract space called phase space, where each point in phase space represents a possible state of that system. And then what they do is you can imagine a sequence of states that a system has over time as it changes over time. And what people do is they define a probability distribution over those trajectories. They say which trajectory is most probable. Is the most probable that we began that's where we're sitting on a trajectory that began, for example, in the Big Bang, or that has some other kind of history. There's a wonderful paper. It's one of my favorite papers. It's this paper right here. It's my paper by Sean Carroll called "In What Sense is the Early Universe Fine-Tuned?" And what he takes you through in that paper in a lot of mathematical detail is precisely how to do these kinds of calculations, how to define a probability measure over a collection of trajectories through phase space. And that's not going to be the sort of thing that's going to require us to talk about defining a parameter over moments that the universe has.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. There's a few things I want to say in response to that. The first thing I would want to say is, I recognize that general relativity is going to give you different results. It has a different model of reality than what I use to make these calculations, which is classical statistical mechanics. But I would argue that even if it is the case that classical mechanics makes assumptions that we know isn't true of reality, that doesn't mean we can't use that as a means to gain insights about natural phenomena and their predictions. So even in general relativity, we know that it kind of breaks down, and we need a theory of quantum gravity ultimately to have a final theory of space-time, right? So even in general relativity, it does break down. But what we can do is, classical mechanics is one of the three main branches of physics for a reason, right? The other two being general relativity and quantum mechanics. What we can do is this. We can say, well, classical mechanics has been really, really successful at making and modeling and making predictions within a certain domain of natural phenomena. And as long as we keep within that domain and do calculations within that domain, we can probably trust the results and predictions it gets us. So all I'm trying to do here is say, what are the odds that, all the particles within our 5-minute light cone are configured correctly versus all the particles within our 10-minute light cone are configured correctly. And those odds are so different that as long as it's still the case that for every particle you have to configure correctly, the chances of that being done, it goes down, then I think my argument can go through. I would also just want to give listeners an analogy. Imagine if, maybe 100 years ago, as we were actually discovering the initial state of the universe, we discovered that in the initial universe, there was actually a configuration of particles that spelled out the first chapter of the Gospel of John perfectly and Koine Greek. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? And then I think everyone would say, wow, if the universe began in cause, for that configuration particles to have been in the initial universe are so unlikely that we should better conclude that the universe had a cause, and maybe this is even really good evidence for theism, right? But if I understand what Dan is saying correctly, then if we can't assign a probability distribution across, potential configurations of particles at a moment in time, then we wouldn't actually be able to say, well, this configuration of particles in that spells out John 1 perfectly is unlikely, right? So we need to be able to have some way of assigning these probabilities. Maybe, Dan, the way you were talking about, I'm
sorry, guys, that we do have to take a quick break. Hit the subscribe button, take a moment to follow, rate the podcast. We'll be back in a moment. We'll continue this conversation. Final part of the discussion coming up on this fascinating topic of whether the universe is 5 minutes old and whether believing in God is relevant to whether we should believe that. We will see you in just a moment.
Pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it.
It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question. We're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms. The arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. The difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
If people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here. This show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online. So thanks again.
Welcome back. You are listening to Unbelievable, the show that asks whether the unbelievable might sometimes actually be true. Today's episode is a great example of that, where we are having a serious conversation with David Liu and Dan Linford about whether the universe is only 5 minutes old, based on David's forthcoming article in the Philosophy of Religion journal, Faith and Philosophy. David, I was thinking it'd be pretty funny the next time you hear someone say, "What do you think, I was born yesterday?" Well, yeah, actually, very interesting hypothesis. Actually, I have a forthcoming article on that. I can give you my arguments if you're interested. Only a philosopher would have that type of response. But Dan, my apologies for cutting you off at the end of the second segment there, and would love to hear you continue your thought.
Yeah. So David's proposal was that we need a probability distribution so we can talk about the fact that it's improbable that the particles at the beginning of time will spell out John chapter 1. I think that was your example. Now there in fact is. In fact, I talked about a way to do that. So here's how to do it. You say, look, given a measure on all these trajectories through space. So the measure we'll typically use is what's called the Louisville measure. Given the Louisville measure, what proportion of trajectories travel through states where early in the universe's history, particles spell out John 1. And what you're going to find out is that, well, on that measure, very few states do that. Right? Like very few trajectories through space have that feature. But that doesn't require us to talk about this idea that we're going to define a parameter over like these slices of the universe that you want to call moments.
Yeah, so maybe I don't understand what the problem is. So why can't we use that same phase space to talk about what the initial state or initial segment of the universe contained, right? So even if you want to say, like, which one is more likely to be in the past history of our universe? A 5-minute perfectly configured light cone or a 10-minute perfectly configured light cone? We don't have to say it was the initial state. We could even just say which one is more likely to have occurred in the past history of our universe that led to us. So we may, if we're just mapping trajectories and you're recognizing that, I don't understand where the issue is.
Well, because what you want to do in your paper, in order to do the kinds of, or answer the questions you want to answer about probability, is that you want to use Robin Collins's unrestricted principle of indifference. And then the problem is going to be that the way that you set that up is not standard. And the variable that you picked out as being a natural variable is arguably not a good choice for a natural variable. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't formulate the argument perhaps in some other way, but we're not here talking about that other paper. We're here talking about this paper.
Yeah, thanks. I guess the conclusion I've come to from this is maybe I need to tweak that principle more in order to make it more aligned with the way physics are currently modeling universes. But I think as long as it is the case, so whatever the principle I use is, as long as it is the case that the more particles I need to be configured correctly in a certain way, the less likely it is to occur, then I think my argument would still run through. Maybe I need to tweak it a bit more. But would you agree with that point at least?
Yeah, so if we're supposing that space-time can be arbitrarily truncated without the causal principle, and we're supposing that that for some reason we need for some perfect configuration of particles at some time in the past. I mean, I'm not sure what justifies that, because we can't see like the exact configuration of particles at arbitrary points in the past. But yeah, supposing that you had both of those assumptions on the table, then then that conclusion might go through.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. And David, so let's say that your argument is successful for the sake of argument for a certain person that is willing to assume that space-time can be truncated. It could have began at any point with the appearance of the history to the universe that we see. And if they're willing to grant to you that there's an equal probability that any of those beginnings could take place, let's just say that for the sake of argument, someone might still say, well, that's fine. Then I believe the universe began uncaused and that it began just a few minutes ago. That's consistent with all my evidence. And, we live in a unbelievable universe. So I'll just bite the bullet and believe that seemingly incredible claim. Someone could respond like that. But I wanted to get to the later portion of your paper as well, where you think you have a second argument in your paper that suggests we can't take that approach because you suggest that there's empirical evidence that we do in fact live in an old universe. So can you begin to sketch that part of your argument and then we'll interact about that?
Yeah, thanks, Vince. Yeah. So someone could say, David, I get up to you to this point, but absurd things happen, crazy things happen. Science is revealing like a world isn't what it seems like. We see with things in the quantum mechanics. So what if I just want to accept the crazy claim that universe is less than 5 minutes old? So what? So the next part of our argument is trying to show that we actually may have empirical evidence that the universe didn't begin less than 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. Uncaused with the appearance of age. So the analogy I will want to give here is imagine that paleontologists have just discovered that there were a bunch of dinosaur fossils that just fluctuated into existence in our geological layer. And they just uncovered a new fossil and they want to determine, did this fossil actually come from a real dinosaur in the past, or did it just pop into existence uncaused? It may have all the appearances of being a dinosaur fossil, but can we actually know, how do we distinguish between the two? So I would say one way a paleontologist can do this, which I think cosmologists can do too, is they can look and they could try to use their various independent methods for dating the age of the fossil. And if those methods agree with each other, then there's a really good chance that the fossil actually came from a real dinosaur. So, paleontologists, they can, do radiocarbon dating to look at the proportion of radiocarbon isotopes in a fossil. And from that, extrapolate the age. They can look at the layer of geological rock that the fossil was discovered. And by dating the layer of rock it was discovered in, they can also extrapolate the age of the fossil there. And if this fossil actually came from a real dinosaur, you could say that the dinosaur and its environment constrained the properties of the fossil so that the layer of rock it was discovered in, and also the radiocarbon isotope proportions it has would align and tell the same story as to the age of the fossil. However, if the fossil just fluctuated into existence uncaused, it could have come into existence in any layer of sedimentary rock, and it could have come into existence with any combination of proportions of these radiocarbon isotopes, right? Such that when we try to measure the age of the fossil, it's almost certainly going to be the case that these age estimates don't agree with each other. So I would say the same is with the universe. If the universe really began less than 5 minutes ago, uncaused with the appearance of age, then all of the methods that cosmologists use to assume the universe began at the Big Bang, and try to extrapolate the age from that, those assumptions would be false, right? Because the universe didn't begin with a Big Bang. The Big Bang could have constrained the properties of whatever star or cosmic microwave background we're observing, right? So scientists have come up with at least 5 different independent ways to measure the age of the universe. One way is by looking at the temperature fluctuations in the cosmic microwave background, which is caused by the radiation emitted by the Big Bang. You can look at these beautiful maps of temperature distributions. And when they map on those temperature distributions into models for the universe, they can extrapolate the age of the universe to be about 13.8 billion years, right? But imagine the universe began uncaused, 5 minutes ago, then there would have been nothing to constrain those temperature distribution patterns in the cosmic microwave background, such that when we plug those into the models, they shouldn't have given us any coherent answer. Similarly, we can date the age of stars in our galaxy, in the universe, by measuring the temperature the star is at, the temperature the star has, and from that extrapolating the age of the star. And we could look at certain proportions of radioisotopes in the star, or heavy elements of those stars, and from that determine the age of the star. And what you would expect if, these are scientifically valid methods is that there would be no star estimated to be older than the universe itself, right? But if the universe began, 5 minutes ago and caused, there would have been nothing to constrain the temperature of the star, the isotope amounts of these stars, such that when we use those methods to measure the age of the universe, a star could have easily been measured to be 50 billion years old. Another one could be measured to be 20 billion years old, right? And they would have no agreement with the ways we try to measure the age of the universe. So I would say the fact that we have 5 independent methods for measuring the age of the universe, and all of them agree with each other, that's very good reason to believe the universe had a cause of its beginning, and that cause had a cause of its beginning to constrain those properties so that they would cohere with one another.
And David, would you need to say more about that cause? I was just thinking, if the cause was, a random universe generator or, an evil god who was inclined to be deceptive about things, you could have a cause that doesn't necessarily get you that conclusion. So do you have to build into the argument a cause of a certain type?
Yeah. So in my paper, I try to argue. Let's go back to the monkey typewriter analogy, right? Let's say you didn't know who was actually typing on the keyboard. And after, whoever's typing on the keyboard types, you survive. I then ask you, what's more likely, who is more likely to have typed that document? A monkey or a intelligent human being, right? I think we will always say it's much more likely that an intelligent human being typed on the keyboard, because an intelligent human being would have the ability to type, would have the knowledge to be able to memorize the first page of Hamlet and be able to type it out, and could probably be benevolent enough to want to save your life, right? So I would say the same with the universe, whatever caused the universe. Just because we have a cause for the universe, we still don't really have a reason to know which universe the cause would bring about, right? Why would the universe bring about, why would the cause of the universe bring about a universe that began the Big Bang, where we can have generally true beliefs about reality? We didn't pop into existence 5 minutes ago, where we can study the cosmos and determine its age accurately. Why would the cause bring about that kind of universe rather than one of the many universes that would be, only 5 minutes old and just give us the appearance of age? And I will argue that we do have an independently motivated hypothesis, namely theism, an all-loving, all-powerful God, would be a great explanation for why for why we live in a universe where we can trust our memories, in which we can study the universe effectively and confidently. Because the all-powerful God will have the ability to bring about the Big Bang universe, but it would also be all-loving, such that he would have good reason to want to create a universe in which we can trust our memories and be confident in our science. So I'll stop there. Curious to hear Dan's thoughts.
Yeah, so on page 23 of the manuscript you sent us, footnote 55, you talk about how, you credit to me, this argument according to which if we deny something called the past hypothesis, then we end up being skeptics about all kinds of things that we shouldn't be skeptical about. We end up not knowing, for example, whether or not the world is as we think it to be, or maybe we each popped into existence 5 minutes ago. If people don't know, the past hypothesis is the hypothesis that in one direction of time that we call the past, the entropy of the universe was very low. Now, that argument, in fact, that if we give up the past hypothesis, then in other parts of this package of hypotheses that end up being called the mentaculus, that hypothesis doesn't originate with me. It originates with another philosopher named David Albert. What's important about, but the reason I bring it up here is because I don't think that you're going to be able to pull off the argument that you think you're going to pull off. So, yeah, we look around and we see that all these different cosmological measures give us a consistent answer for the age of the universe. But what is actually more if we suppose that the universe could have started 5 minutes ago and so on, what is a more probable state? That all of those numbers just accidentally align, or that the universe is actually old? Well, if you do this calculation in the framework of classical statistical mechanics, right, which is the framework that you said you wanted to use, then what you're going to find out is that it's most probable that those measures just accidentally align, unless you assume the full package of hypotheses that come along with the mentaculus, that is, including a hypothesis according to which the universe is very old, and it had this low entropy state in the distant past. So we're not going to be able to show from these observations that that it's in fact real that the universe is very old. The only way we can do that is if we conditionalize our probabilities on the full package of hypotheses that appear in the mentaculus. Without conditionalizing our probabilities on the mentaculus package, classical statistical mechanics tells us that in fact we're subject to this grand illusion all the time, and that we don't live in the universe we think that we live in.
Yeah, Jan. So can you just maybe explain more about why exactly the age of the universe would align? Like, I'm just imagining, like, you look at the cosmic microwave background, you look at the pattern, anyone can Google it, look at it. If that pattern was just a completely different distribution, we plugged it into our models for, calculating the age of the universe based off that, it's obviously going to give a wrong result, right? Like, I don't understand how exactly that it would give the correct result. If you can explain that.
So what people realized a long time ago is that there are macroscopic physical processes that only happen in one direction, right? So if I've got an ice cube, for example, an ice cube will melt. It doesn't naturally unmelt. I mean, you could put it in a refrigerator if you wanted to, but that would take energy to get it to freeze again. If you just have an ice cube and leave it on its own, it melts. So why does it do that? It does that because there are many more states that the atoms composing the ice cube can be in, where the cube has melted, than there are states in which it's frozen into that ice cube. And so if you come across an ice cube, you ask, well, I don't know what trajectories the individual atoms are on. I don't know what it's going to do. But you can still say most likely it's going to end up in a melted state. That's why you always see things melt and you never see them unmelt. However, the laws of physics are time symmetric. So if you find a system in a configuration like an ice cube, and then you imagine what is the most probable state that it could have come from, the most probable state it could have come from is in fact also the melted state. Now that's not what you observe, right? You don't observe the ice cube coming from a melted. You don't observe like puddles suddenly forming into cubes and forming back into puddles, right? That's completely outside of our experience. Now, in order to get things to come out the right way, what you have to do in classical statistical mechanics, in fact, this is true for there's an analog of this that's true for quantum statistical mechanics as well, is you have to have this boundary condition in one direction of time that the entropy is very low, and that's going to explain why it is that if you grab some random part of the universe and you pull it out, you see it do one thing, you see it melt in the case of an ice cube, and why you don't say that it most likely came from the melted state. Now, if you ask, okay, what about our, say, memories of the past? Well, there are many more trajectories in which, if you don't assume that there's a low entropy condition in one direction of time, then there's many more trajectories that the atoms composing your brain or whatever could take, in which you spontaneously form a memory of something that never happened. Then there are ways of forming a memory from something that did. And so this is what people call the Boltzmann brain problem, right? That an entire brain could fluctuate into existence if that's more probable than having you exist, for example, or having everything that you take to exist. That if you had some cloud at thermodynamic equilibrium, the most probable way to get your experiences is for a brain to spontaneously prop into existence. Why is that more probable? Because it's less costly thermodynamically, right? So like your brain, in order to have the experiences it has over, say, the course of 5 minutes, that takes far less of a reduction in entropy than having all the experiences you have and having the world you think you live in and so on. Thermodynamically speaking, that's much more costly. And why is it much more costly? Precisely because it's thermodynamically speaking much less probable, unless you again you conditionalize on on what people call the mentaculus, which is the conjunction of three hypotheses. First of all, the past hypothesis. Second, the fundamental dynamical laws, whatever they turn out to be. And third, a uniform distribution over microphysical states. Unless you conditionalize your probabilities over those three hypotheses, then the most probable way to get the observations we think we make of the universe is for them to spontaneously pop into existence. So the only way that you can say that you're able to gather data and accurately make assessments of the universe is if you put this low entropy boundary condition in one direction of time. Without that, you can't reach this conclusion.
Yeah, okay, maybe this is something we can discuss further. It just doesn't seem like if the universe began really 5 minutes ago, and the way we discover how old a star is based off its temperature. It's really hard for me to see why there could have been a star with a certain temperature that was estimated to make that estimate like 20 million years ago.
But you wouldn't really be measuring the temperature of that star, right? Without conditionalizing on the mentaculus, what you have is some data in front of you on Earth. I mean, maybe. It's much more probable that you're just having a 5 minute or so experience than it is that you live an entire lifetime and we have scientific instruments of various kinds and so on.
I see. So you're saying when we're doing science, we're presupposing the mentaculus, these three conditions, and you have to presuppose them for science to work. So, well, I would argue we can presuppose those. Let's operate under the assumption that we have those three conditions met. The universe really did begin with the Big Bang, right? If we actually, believe the universe began on cause, we can start with presuppositions, and we say, okay, if those presuppositions are true, but if the universe actually began with the Big Bang, those presuppositions wouldn't be true. Therefore, we wouldn't expect all of these different, ways to measure the age of the universe to be correct. Like we can say, we have to trust that we can get scientific results in the first place before we can go out and measure them. But what we'd expect that the universe began in cause is that assumption is wrong. We actually can't trust our scientific understanding because all these estimates for the age of the universe are false, right? So we start with that presupposition, but we actually turn out that presupposition must be wrong, given that we can't actually measure the age of the universe accurately.
Well, but what you're trying to do here is to rule in. What you're trying to do is you're trying to rule out the hypothesis that the universe, for example, began 5 minutes ago. And your reason for doing that is to say that we have all these independent estimates of the age of the universe. They all agree with one another. Well, it turns out that there's more ways to get that agreement on the hypothesis the universe is illusory, that it doesn't have that age, than there are ways to get that age on the hypothesis the universe really has that age. So this is why you can't. This is a classic thing in philosophy of physics, that you can't overcome the Boltzmann brain problem by going out and doing measurements. That's just the wrong way to think about the issue. The right way to think about the issue is that we have to presuppose that we're not Boltzmann brains in order to get science started in the first place. But trying to rule out these other spurious hypotheses where the world turns out to be illusory, well, those are precisely the hypotheses you have to have already ruled out in order to be doing science in the first place. You have to already be conditionalizing the probability statements that you make on the package of hypotheses that we call the mentaculus.
All right, so maybe I could just ask you what you would conclude from this example. Let's say we did go out and measure the age of the universe by measuring the cosmic microwave background, by measuring the Hubble's constant, by measuring the age of the oldest stars. And we found out that none of them actually agreed with each other. Like none of these estimates agree with each other. They all gave different results. That's totally, at least, possible that happened, right? I would say that's actually good. That would be actually good evidence the universe began on cause. But you would say, no, that's not good evidence. I don't want to put words in your mouth. So
I don't know what we would conclude in that case, because I don't know what hypothesis we would formulate. I mean, obviously, we wouldn't formulate the hypothesis that we have formulated about the universe's history. We would have to formulate some other kind of hypothesis. The hypothesis that we currently have the one that's confirmed by all the data that you've brought up, is one according to which, in one direction of time, the universe, or at least the observable universe, the portion of the universe that we can see, was once in a very hot, dense state. So that all of these structures must have formed after it was in that hot, dense state where the structures couldn't have formed. Right? That's what we can conclude. But we can't conclude that we can't like start in a place where we don't know whether or not the universe is 5 minutes old, and we don't know whether or not there's a low entry boundary condition to the past, and so on and so forth. We can't start from that position. That won't allow us to do the kind of cosmological science that we want to do.
Guys, I hope this is just the beginning of this conversation. Sadly, we have to finish there for now. Been a really great discussion with my guests, David Liu and Dan Linford. We've been exploring some newly proposed reasons for believing in God. David has suggested God may be the only good explanation of why the universe is more than 5 minutes old. And God may be the only good explanation of the incredible alignment we find among the different dating methods for the universe. Dan has given some robust objections as well to those arguments. Let's keep this conversation going. Check out David's paper in the description, Dan's podcast, Sci-Fi, and by telling us what you think by emailing us at unbelievable@premier.org.uk. To leave you with just a final thought, one thing that this paper and this episode has highlighted for me is, the likelihood of a hypothesis being true, whatever hypotheses you're considering about the deepest questions of life, it depends on what alternative hypotheses are out there. And, we've considered some, not all, but some of the primary options today for explaining the universe's existence. We've talked about it being created by God. We've talked about it being uncaused. We've talked about it existing eternally. And maybe like me, you respond with the thought, boy, all of those options that we've discussed seem pretty incredible. And so, one of the conclusions that I come to is that we live in a crazy world. And so we need to take crazy hypotheses seriously. It's not rational to dismiss a hypothesis just because it's seemingly unbelievable if all we have are seemingly unbelievable options. In some sense, that's, I guess, the very premise of this podcast. And one of the things I love about this is that it allows us to, just wonder again at how magnificent the universe it is, marvel at what we might come to believe. And it also invites us to trade condemnation for curiosity when it comes to each other's beliefs. And I just think Dan and David have modeled that for us so well today. We can't just write each other off because someone else believes something that we find unbelievable. It may be that something unbelievable just winds up being true. So for now, I'm Vince Vitale. I've been here with David Liu and Dan Linford. It's been great to be with all of you. We'll see you very soon for more discussions and debates on unbelievable. Until then, from me and the team, goodbye.